Good evening.
Good evening.
There we go. Okay, we're on chapter 7 of Hosea. Trucking along at a pretty good pace. I think we're still technically behind because I want to say the first chapter up into 2 lessons. Never made that back up. But, at some point, we're going to make it up or we won't. And we'll just turn this 14-chapter book into 15 lessons and break my tradition. But before we begin, I will say, I mentioned when we wrapped up chapter 6 last week that a lot of, commentators, if you're reading a commentary and, they break it up sort of section by section, they will lump in verse 11 with the first half of verse 1 from chapter 7. So it would read something like, "Alas, O Judah, a harvest is appointed for you. When I return the captives of my people, when I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria." They break it right there, and then the second half of verse 1 of chapter 7 would begin a new section. And so, before we sort of dig into what's on your paper and before we sort of start reading chapter 7, I'll just sort of talk about this. This isn't a huge thing one way or the other, but it's a little interesting. There's a little debate as to where the emphasis exactly should be placed in verse 1 of chapter 7. If the emphasis should be placed on the whole would have aspect, when I would have healed Israel. And breaking down the 2 different ways to emphasize different elements of this verse, a commentator wrote basically, okay, if we're emphasizing the would have part, it would basically mean something like, I have many times wanted to heal Israel. I could not do it because of their iniquity. So you have that option. Or maybe the emphasis should be placed on the exposing of Ephraim and Samaria. So when I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered and the wickedness of Samaria. So if you're emphasizing that same commentator says it would be something like, the restoration of the nation will involve the exposure and the healing of their sins. Also worth noting is that the whole would have translation is pretty questionable. A lot of people don't even know, that is a good translation. A lot of people say it should basically be something like, when I heal Israel, or something along those lines. But going off of what I argued for last week, that we know historically only Judah had their captives returned, or as the NIV translates it, their fortunes restored. But at the same time, we've seen in other books in the Minor Prophets how even the North still had a spiritual restoration promised to the remnant, right? I think either option kind of works, and there's probably some truth to both emphases, right? The bottom line ultimately is that Israel, both north and south, even though, Ephraim and Samaria are specifically northern locations, both, all of Israel's sin, north and south, will be exposed. And right, the whole focus on Ephraim and Samaria, it makes sense that Hosea is going to focus in on that because he's talking to the northern kingdom. He's talking to Israel. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and actually read the 16 verses of chapter 7. So starting in verse 1, once again, when I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria. For they have committed fraud. A thief comes in. A band of robbers takes spoil outside. They do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their own deeds have surrounded them. They are before my face. They make a king glad with their wickedness, and princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by a baker. He ceases stirring the fire after kneading the dough, until it is leavened. In the day of our king, princes have made him sick, inflamed with wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers. They prepare their heart like an oven while they lie in wait. Their baker sleeps all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. They are all hot like an oven. All have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me. Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. Aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not know it. Yes, gray hairs are here and there on him, yet he does not know it. And the pride of Israel testifies to his face, but they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. Wherever they go, I will spread my net on them. I will bring them down like birds of the air. I will chastise them according to what their congregation has heard. Woe to them, for they have fled from me. Destruction to them, because they have transgressed against me, though I redeemed them. Yet they have spoken lies against me. They do not cry out to me with their heart when they wailed on their beds. They assemble together for grain and new wine. They rebel against me. Though I disciplined and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not to the Most High. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword. For the cursing of their tongue, this shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. So, okay. There's not a title for this first bullet point. And when we get to the part that is your blank, I will try to emphasize that. But if you're paying attention, then you'll probably pick up on it before I do. That's where you have to fill something in. So, right off the bat in 7:1, 7:2, 7:1 anyway, we have more of the same from what we've seen elsewhere in the Minor Prophets, right? It's not even taking into account the first half of 7:1, just the second half. They've committed fraud. A thief comes in. A band of robbers takes spoil outside. We've seen a lot of this before. We've seen general condemnation of wickedness before, and we've even seen condemnation of these same type of sins before. I want to say we've even seen condemnation of these same types of sins before already in Hosea. So it's kind of a lot of more of the same. When things really get interesting, though, is in 7:2. And this is not your fill in the blank portion, so you're going to have to listen for a little while before we get to that. Even though I did put that in here, it's because it relates to the fill in the blank portion. But this is where things get interesting, right? It says, they do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. So this is somewhat unique, right? This, 7:1b, the last half of 7:1, kind of seen it before. Not to say it's not important. There's just not a lot there. 7:2 is where things get interesting. This is kind of unique. They do not consider in their hearts, I remember all their wickedness, right? We've seen condemnation for people who just straight up don't care at all about their wickedness, right? You lie, you cheat, you steal, you murder, all sorts of sexual sin, whatever, and you just don't care at all. We've seen condemnation of that. We've seen condemnation for people who think God won't punish them for their wickedness, right? It's not that they don't care in the sense that, people today sin and they don't care because they don't believe in God. But we've also seen in the Minor Prophets people who believe in God and worship God, not in a true sense, but, in some sense. And they just think, well, I'm above judgment because, God's not going to judge me because I'm an Israelite, or God's not going to judge me because I'm a priest, or whatever, right? We've seen condemnation for, people who, that was it. Yeah, for people who don't care about their wickedness, or for people who think God's not going to punish them for their wickedness. And then now, right, what's unique about 7:2 is we have condemnation for people who don't realize that God remembers all of their wickedness, right? And aside from the obvious here of, these people are assuming, God only remembers my last 10 sins, for an example, right? Because it says, they do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. I mean, aside from the very face value reading of like, they're not taking into account that God's not just remembering the last sin you committed or the last 10 sins you committed, but he knows every sin you've committed, right? There is actually something really cool here historically, and there's more at play than you would probably pick up from just a face value reading. And it actually makes a lot of sense given what we've seen so far in the book of Hosea, right? Think about Israel's religious syncretism that we've been talking about pretty much every lesson, right? Something old, something new, something pagan, something true, right? We're just throwing it all together and seeing whatever sticks. Canaanite religion in that day, pagan religion, it was all about one's own experience with God, right? There was very little to no importance placed on God or the gods or whatever, right? As being present throughout all of history. It's just sort of, you have an experience with Baal or Asherah or whatever pagan god it is. And so there wasn't really any sort of communal aspect to worship throughout history anyway. Also, what this led to was that any sort of moral code that there would be associated with these pagan religions was kind of just up to interpretation. It was up to every individual. And that is your blank. There's very little to no importance placed on God or God's being, I'm trying to find the exact word, present throughout all of history. And then the moral code was kind of up to every individual, right? So it's a very individualistic religion. And so God here in Hosea chapter 7, verse 2, or verse 1, let me backtrack a little bit. He's calling out the whole of Israel, right? Fraud, theft, robbery, all these things. But Israel, verse 2, doesn't realize God remembers all of their wickedness, right? Corporate wickedness, right? So, Hosea is coming along, the wickedness of Samaria, the iniquity of Ephraim, it's going to be uncovered. What have they done? They committed fraud. The thieves come in. The band of robbers take their spoil. Israel's hearing this and they're saying, right, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not, committing fraud. I'm not thieving or robbing, right? And God says, right, they do not consider that I remember all their wickedness, right? There's this corporate aspect to worship, and God is condemning corporate sins of Israel. It isn't just the top percentile being condemned here, right? We talked about this top-down problem. It's never just the kings and the princes being called out, or the priests, for that matter, being called out, right? Like it says here in Hosea, go back a few chapters, like people, like priests. So, the people were just as guilty, even if they weren't necessarily committing these exact same type of sins. It's the whole nation, right? Also, God isn't just addressing some form of immorality, but he's addressing every form of immorality, right? But ultimately, God's message falls on deaf ears. Why? Because, once again, the people don't realize that God remembers and sees all. So much so, right, that it will go on to say that God's, the last half of, the last half of verse 2, their own deeds have surrounded them there before my face, right? So they're not realizing that God remembers and God sees all sin, corporate sin, throughout all history, throughout all of Israel, right? So much so, right? It's, it says their own deeds are before my face, right? You want to think of God as some man with a beard sitting up in the sky. You can do that, I guess, right? think of how much sin there has to be for it to reach the face of God, right? I mean, the point is, right? I mean, anywhere God is looking, he's just seeing the sins of Israel, right? And they're not thinking that way, right? They're thinking very individualistically, likely because of the syncretism with these pagan religions. So everything else you have, it's not really a fill in the blank. It's just mostly people's names. And some of these people's names are listed twice, and that's not a typo this time. Even though normally it would be.
This time?
Yeah, this time. Emphasis on the this time. So, right, we'll sort of talk about this. So continuing on this train of thought of, okay, God is condemning corporate Israel, right? We have in verse 4 of chapter 7, it says, they are all adulterers. So again, all of Israel. Verse 7 of chapter 7, they are all hot like an oven. And this is really where we're going to start to get into all these people's names and get into a lot of history, but I promise you it's all relevant, so try to stick with me, okay? The idea, right, of they're all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges, all their kings have fallen, none among them calls upon me, right? The idea here, it's this turnover of leadership, right? I mean, we talked about this week 1, and, I've also brought this up in some of the Sunday morning sermons that I've done recently, and pretty sure we've covered this besides chapter 1 in Hosea. Very big theme in Hosea, and also, I mean, just other books of the Bible dealing with this time period. There's a lot of political turnover, right? And so this whole, they've devoured all their judges, all their kings have fallen. This is true, right? Historically true. The last king of the southern kingdom, right? Hosea is talking to the northern kingdom, but if you go back to the prologue, right? The last king of the southern kingdom that's listed in chapter 1 is Hezekiah. Hezekiah began his reign in 716 or 715 BC. Hezekiah different from Zechariah, so in order not to confuse yourself, if you're going to write that down, maybe write that in the margin or something. Just a fair warning. But Hezekiah, his reign began in 716, 715. Jeroboam II, which is the only king from the northern kingdom, which Hosea was talking to, the only king listed for the northern kingdom, his reign ended between 753 and 746 BC. We don't really know. There's, like with most kings, there's a lot of debate. And this is a quote that I used when we covered chapter 1, but I'll say it again. The rapid changes in leadership in the north after Jeroboam II's death may have been confusing to many southerners of the era after Samaria's fall. And so it would be ignorable by the writer of verse 1 of chapter 1. So you have anywhere basically taking the earlier date of, let's say, Jeroboam II's reign ended in 753 to, the last king of the south mentioned in the prologue of Hosea, which is Hezekiah, who began his reign in 716, 715, right? I mean, we have quite a long time there where there's not another northern king listed, right? And so you have a lot of time to work with. So what kind of rapid changes, from that quote that I just read, what kind of rapid changes are we talking about? Well, once again, this political instability, this, backstabbing murder. So Jeroboam, the second successor, Zechariah, this is the first bullet-pointed guy you have. Right, Jeroboam II dies. This guy named Zechariah takes over. He ruled for a whopping 6 months before he was assassinated. All right. Zechariah, he ruled for 6 whole months before he was assassinated. He was assassinated by a guy named Shallum. Shallum then became king, and he ruled for a whopping 1 month before he was assassinated. He was assassinated by a guy named Menahem. Now, Menahem is kind of unique in that he actually was not assassinated. He ruled for 10 years. So, given the last two guys, that's an improvement for sure. He was not assassinated. But Menahem's son, Pekahiah, it's on your sheet. You can figure out how to pronounce it how you wish.
Pekahiah.
Pekahiah.
If you spell it right, it's Pekahiah. Right? Pekahiah.
It's all Hebrew to me, man. I don't know.
It's written in English.
So that's Menahem's son. So Menahem wasn't assassinated. His son took over, ruled for 2 years. So better than the 6 months and the 1 month. Not quite as good as his dad, who ruled for 10 years. He ruled for 2 years, and he was assassinated by a guy named Pekah. That's right. Pekah was assassinated by Hosea. And Hosea was the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel before Assyria's takeover, before the conquest, before the exile, before the fall of Samaria, right? So quite literally when it says, right, Israel was like an oven, devouring their judges and all their kings have fallen. Quite literally, I mean, right, this happened, right? This was happening. This did happen. This would continue to happen, right? From the time of when Hosea was giving this. Not only were they like an oven in the sense that they all corporately have broken the covenant, but like we said, that there is this political instability of, right, I'm going to murder you and then I'm going to become king. And then 6 months later, someone's going to murder me and become king. And a year later, someone's going to murder them and become king. On and on and on.
History of the world.
It goes. Yeah, pretty much. So moving into verse 8, we have this Ephraim language once again, right? Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. So what isn't in view here, likely, is, what likely isn't in view is intermarriage, right? That would happen after the Assyrian conquest, during the exile, kind of after the exile, right? When they just kind of decided to settle down and intermarry and start a family, right? That's likely not what's in view here. Think again, you have these rapid changes in leadership, right? Kings being assassinated, their assassins taking their place. That's a really dumb rule to have, by the way. If you just kill a guy, you can take his position of authority. I'm very glad that we don't have that. Anyway, that's off topic, though. That's a topic for a completely different thing. But think about these rapid changes in leadership. In addition, with the rapid changes in leadership came rapid changes in policy, right? I mean, we're kind of familiar with this in America because, every 4 to 8 years, we get a new guy in office and certain policies will change, right? But even with that, it's still kind of lost on us because, it's not like, say the new person in office. It's crazy to me that this is an election year because this has been like the most non-eventful election year recently for me. I don't really keep up with the news, so that might be part of it. But anyway, again, digressing. Just pretend like we get a completely different person in office. Not Trump, not Biden, someone completely new. Mickey Mouse runs for president. He wins by a landslide. All right. Mickey Mouse cannot just come in and completely change everything about our country, right? We have these checks and balances, right? Not entirely the case with ancient Israel. So we think we kind of understand, new guy in power, new rules. But it was like way worse back then because there wasn't, there wasn't like a Congress where they had to decide things as much. Getting off track, and I apologize, but the point is, right, in addition with the rapid changes in leadership came rapid changes specifically in alliances with foreign nations. All right. That's why your last 3 bullet points are this guy's alliance, this guy's alliance, this guy's alliance. So think back to Menahem, right? That was what we said, the only guy not to be assassinated. To be fair, Hosea, we don't know if he was outright assassinated. He was taken captive during the Assyrian conquest. We don't really know what his fate was. I mean, likely at some point he was killed by Assyria. In that sense, I guess that would be an assassination, but we don't really know. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to call Menahem the only guy since Jeroboam II not to be assassinated. So Menahem, his rule began in either 745 BC or 752 BC and ended in either 738 BC or 742 BC. That's a lot of numbers. Bear with me. Tiglath-Pileser III, right? Ruler of Assyria for a while. His rule began in 745 BC. So Tiglath-Pileser III's rule began, this is the important part, either began the same year as Menahem or 7 years after Menahem's rule began. Meaning Menahem was the first king of Israel that Assyria dealt with and that Tiglath-Pileser III dealt with. So this is what you want to write down by Menahem's alliance. 2 Kings 15:19. 2 Kings 15:19 says, Then Pul, king of Assyria, that's Tiglath-Pileser, but likely his personal, less formal name. Then Pul, king of Assyria, invaded the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his own hold on the kingdom. So this offering, it's recorded in 2 Kings. It's also recorded in the annals of Tiglath-Pileser. So we have extra biblical evidence for this as well. So Menahem's alliance, he made an alliance with Assyria. He made an alliance with Tiglath-Pileser. And if only he knew how bad that would come to bite Israel later down the line. So that kind of starts the whole Assyria problem, right? You can't really blame the guy because, had he not paid the tribute offering, they probably would have been wiped out a lot sooner than they did, but, it is what it is. So, right, you have Menahem, you have Pekahiah. I know you want to make some comment about the pronunciation or whatever. Skip him, right? Nothing really changes. Pekah, all right? So we're 2 removed from Menahem. Pekah comes along a little bit later, and he makes an alliance of his own. So Pekah allied with the king of Aram, which is, just think of it as Syria, basically. All right? So Pekah and the king of Aram, they marched on Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, right? Pekah being king of the north, this guy from Aram just being, over in Syria, right? They start an alliance. They're marching on Jerusalem. They're marching on the southern kingdom, all right? The southern kingdom's ruler at the time was Ahaz. And Ahaz, he doesn't think he can win this, right? The southern kingdom's army versus the army of the northern kingdom and the army of Aram or Syria. So he calls on Tiglath-Pileser, right? He calls up his old buddy from Assyria. He says, hey, man, if we pay you a bunch of money, will you come save us and, go defeat Aram or go defeat Syria for us? So that's what happened. Tiglath-Pileser ended up capturing Damascus, which, Damascus, Syria, if you know your geography, there you go. Deported all the people who lived in Damascus, killed the ruler of Aram, who, by the way, Pekah made an alliance with when they marched on Jerusalem, then went to Israel, the northern kingdom, where Pekah was at, and ended up taking some territory there and exiling those people. 2 Kings 15, I did not write down the verse, so my apologies. But it says, in the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and took, more biblical names, Ijon, Abel, Beth, Makkah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hazor. He took Gilead and Galilee, including all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria. So obviously we think of the Assyrian exile as, okay, well, Samaria, the capital of the north, falls, and then the exile happens. But there were these lesser exiles that happened even before that. And we see this all the way in Pekah's day, right? All because he made this really dumb alliance with the king of Aram and marched on Jerusalem. So, and this is also recorded in the history of Tiglath-Pileser. So we have extra biblical evidence for this as well. Pekah's successor, Hosea, remember the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel before it eventually fell to Assyria. Hosea also tried making a foreign alliance. So we have Menahem who did the alliance with Assyria. I'm going to pay you all this money. Please don't kill us. Pekah made an alliance with Syria or Aram, marched on Jerusalem. That ended badly. So then you have Hosea who comes into the picture. And 2 Kings 17 records, I also didn't write down the verse for this, so I apologize. But 2 Kings 17 records that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hosea. So we're not dealing with Tiglath-Pileser anymore. He's died. We got a new guy in power. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hosea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hosea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, a king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the ninth year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah and Gozan on the Habor River and in the towns of the Medes. So that is the big exile that we think about, right? Samaria falls, the people are captured, they're sent away, they're exiled, they're deported, right? That's the big exile that we think about. And all this happened because Hosea made an alliance with Egypt, right? My actually, they weren't even related at that point, so I can't say great-great-granddaddy. But, the king, however many generations before me, started this whole mess. He started an alliance with Assyria, started paying these guys off not to kill us. Hosea says, I'm tired of that. I'm not going to give any money to Assyria. I'm going to give them money to Egypt. Right? Assyria finds out about that. And what happens? They smoke them, right? Samaria falls, the people are exiled, right? Not just to Assyria, but also, other places as well. So, all of this to say, right, we see that not only does Israel's monarchy constantly change, right? They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen, right? Not only do we have that going on, but also Israel's foreign policy is constantly changing during this time, right? Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples, Hosea writes. Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. And this is, ding, 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 right? You have mention of what I just said. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria, right? And all this is backed up historically. But even though they call out to Egypt and they go to Assyria, it ends with, ultimately, wherever they go, I will spread my net on them, right? God talking, of course. So Israel's condemned because, right, verse 10, they do not return to the Lord their God, which corresponds to verse 4, which says, right, they're all adulterers, right? So Israel's condemned because of this corporate rejection of God, this corporate covenantal disobedience, which goes back to what I was saying about the whole individualistic way of thinking from your first bullet point of them saying, well, yeah, I mean, I don't do that, you know. Yeah, I mean, maybe I like, you know, I might beat my dog, but, you know, I've never like beat a person, you know, using a goofy example or whatever, right? But it's this corporate condemnation of Israel. Also, they're condemned because it says they do not seek me for this, right? Verse 10, the pride of Israel testifies to his face, but they do not return to the Lord their God. So, adultery aspect from verse 4, corporate condemnation. Also, nor seek him for this, nor seek him for all this. All this, of course, being, right, political stability, right? They're seeking Egypt. They're seeking Assyria, right? They're seeking Syria. But they're not seeking God for all this, right? And, you know, the rest of the chapter, I mean, verses 12, which I talked about a little bit, you know, 13, 14, 15, 16, it's all more of just God calling out this misplaced trust. You know, misplaced trust in foreign rebellion as opposed to God. Also more of calling out this corporate rebellion, right? Which includes the murder of the kings, right? Again, I mean, that's something, you know. Well, I've never murdered a king. I've never killed some guy and then taken his place. No, but you are all adulterers, right? And you all have, right, what is, I'm trying to find the right verse. I don't know. It's probably in my notes at some point. You all have turned away from me, basically, is the point, right? Verse 13, woe to them, for they have fled from me. Oh, this is it, right? Because they have transgressed against me, verse 13, right? Because they have transgressed against me, right? Oh, I've never murdered a king. No, but you're all adulterers, verse 4, and verse 13, you've all transgressed against me. Verse 14, they rebel against me. Verse 15, they devise evil against me. Verse 16, their princes shall fall by the sword. So again, getting into that political instability aspect, right? So chapter 7, I mean, there's a lot here that you can pick up with just a face value reading of like, okay, they were doing some pretty shady stuff. But I mean, when you get into the history of it, okay, they were constantly turning over kings at some point every couple months, right? If not every couple years. And then also they were making alliances with everybody but God. I mean, you know, this is, you know, these are the people that like enslaved you for like 400 years and that like, you know, in your religion, like the biggest miracle to ever happen is the fact that you got freed from being enslaved to these people. And now you're going to turn around and say, hey, I'm going to pay money to you so you'll like me. So that way, if Assyria attacks us, you'll come in and help us because we're paying you all this money, right? I mean, they're literally turning to everybody but God. So it's this corporate condemnation of Judah for not only just, you know, what we see in the last half of verse 1, not only because of the fraud and the theft and the robbery, but this corporate condemnation for ultimately putting their trust in every single thing but God. So anyway, anything I need to clarify or anyone wants to ask or anything I need to repeat as far as bullet points or anything?
You only have 2 on there, so.
Well, I mean,
the bullet point.
Yeah.
But, you know, God warned them not to make alliances.
Yeah.
And they made plenty of them.
Well, I mean, even this is a warning to some degree because, yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly when Hosea was written, but it was written before the fall of the Northern Kingdom. So, I mean, you know, when it says they call to Egypt, I mean, this was given likely before Hosea actually made a alliance with Egypt, right? So, anyway. But you were talking about God warned them, and God warned them before, and God is
And they
warning
did
them.
it big time, and they paid for it.
Yeah,
big time.
God warned them before, and God also is warning them here, likely before it happens. So
He warns them again.
okay, in that case, I will hand it off for the prayer time.